The chairman of Berkshire Hathaway, one of the richest people in the world, Warren Buffett, turned 90 the end of August. And a financial columnist took the opportunity of his birthday to write an article about one of the chief principles that Warren Buffett used to become one of the richest people in the world. Listen to what it says. The chairman of Berkshire Hathaway Incorporated is one of the most successful investors of all time, having amassed a net worth estimated at $83 billion. Yet, he accrued nearly 90% of that sum after the age of 65. Investing well is important, but investing well for a long time matters even more. I've long recommended, Mr. Buffett said, what I call the Methuselah Technique. That, as he explained in a letter he wrote to the investors on January 18, 1965, is the combination of a long life and a stable, attractive investment return. Mr. Buffett read in a book at the age of 10 years old of how to make $1,000. And when he read that book, he learned that if he took his $1,000 and he invested it for 5 years at 10% interest, it would become $1,600. If he did it for 10 years, it would become over $2,600. If he did it for 25 years, it would be over $10,000. If he did it over 50 years, it would be over $100,000, $1,000. Investors call this principle return on investment, or ROI, return on investment. And Warren Buffett had learned that you needed to have the long view when you looked at the return on an investment. And he was so meticulous at applying this principle. Listen to what it says about Mr. Buffett. When he paid $31,500 for his house in Omaha, he called it Buffett's Folly, because in his mind, $31,500 was $1 million after compounding into the future. His friends and family regularly heard the young Mr. Buffett mutter things like, "Do I really want to spend $300,000 for this haircut?" Or, "I'm not sure I want to blow $500,000 that way," when pondering whether to spend a few bucks. To him, a few dollars spent that day were hundreds of thousands of dollars foregone in the future because they couldn't compound. I imagine we could learn a lot from Mr. Buffett about the return on investment. But my purpose today is to talk to you about the return on investment, the ROI, not of how we can leverage our earthly treasures to make the most money, but how we can convert our earthly investments into treasure in heaven. How we can have a very high return on investment in heavenly treasure. Jesus said that there is treasure that can rot. He said, "Do not store up for yourself treasures on earth where moth and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal." Last week when we were setting up for worship, I couldn't help but notice a squirrel was scurrying around the yard, hiding his winter stash of nuts. Just going all over the yard, trying to find it. Well, imagine, if you would, a squirrel who had a very good fall season, and he managed to accumulate all sorts of acorns and walnuts, and he had strategically hidden them in all sorts of places, and he knew where they were. And he had so much that he had more than enough for that winter, more than enough for 2 winters, more than enough for 3 winters. He had enough for 4 winters. But it was a very harsh winter that year. And not every squirrel was as fortunate as this squirrel. Many of the squirrels were suffering. Some of them even died because there were not enough walnuts and almonds to go around. Now, this squirrel could have decided to share some of his walnuts and acorns. But you know what? What if next fall wasn't quite as good as this fall? And what if next winter was just as harsh as this winter? So he dared not share a single acorn or walnut. Well, winter turns to spring, spring to summer, summer to fall, and the next winter occurred, and it was true, he did not have quite as good of a fall that year. But he got a few. But being the wise squirrel he wasn't going to eat the the walnuts and acorns that he had found that year. He said, well, I should use up the old stock first. So he began to dig up the old acorns and walnuts that he had stored away, and he found out that they were infested with insects. They were no good to eat. And with every rotten acorn and walnut he dug up, with a heavy heart, he said to himself, this acorn, that could have sustained my brother Bob and he would not have died. That walnut, that could have helped my sister Susie and she would not have had to suffer as she did. With each rotten acorn and walnut, these thoughts weighed heavily on his mind. And if we're honest with ourselves, do we not have a tendency to do the same? Every time we buy a tablet or a computer or some piece of technology that we don't really need, or every time that we buy a car a year or two earlier when the old car was just working just fine, or every time we go for an extra trip that really far surpasses our need for an occasional Sabbath break. Every time we say, well, I need those new clothes, or I need this, or I need that. Are we not just amassing for ourselves treasure on earth, which will ultimately, one day, for all of us, rot? There is treasure that will last. There's treasure that can never be taken away from you. It's the treasure that you store up in heaven. And Paul explains what Jesus meant in 1 Timothy when Jesus was talking about treasure in heaven. He said, well, the treasure in heaven consists in good deeds, generosity, and the willingness to share. Now, I would be the first to confess that I have a whole lot, Jessica and I have a whole lot to learn about return on investment and heavenly treasure, the ROI of heavenly treasure. But there's been a few times where I think we may have made an okay decision. Some of my financial advisors and the ROI of heavenly treasure have been a curriculum that I was told to lead when I was a seminarian. It was called Lazarus of the Gate. They said, well, you're going to co-lead this study. That's part of being a seminarian. We get to decide what you're going to teach. So you're going to teach this. So I did. And Lazarus of the Gate was a curriculum. It was based on challenging the participants to learn the biblical foundations of generosity. And I remember as a seminary student working to lead that study, and Jessica and I had some china that we have had since we got married. It was a wedding gift. And by this time, the china had started to get some chips. There were some chips in the bowls and the plates. And we really wanted to get a new china set. It was not a huge expense, but for a seminary student, it was significant. It would have been $50 or so to replace that. We also had some mishmash silverware, which I had since before we got married, and that was the silverware that we used. And we had planned to replace that silverware, but when I read through that curriculum and when we were talking about it, I said, why do we need to do that now? I mean, the chip bowl, the chip plates, they work just fine for food. The silverware, we're able to use it, they're functional. And we forwent it, and we decided to instead use that money to give more to the church that we were attending at that time. Another one of my financial advisors in the ORI of Heavenly Treasure was Goodwin. And Craig Goodwin and his family decided to do a really extraordinary experiment. For an entire year, they were only going to live on what they could buy locally or grow or make on their own. You can think about the implications of that. They had very, very few predetermined exceptions. One of them was coffee, because they could not buy that locally. They had to import that. But they went through that entire year, and one of the things that they did is they actually went from a 2-car family to a 1-car family. I remember talking to Jessica. I said, I think we could get to the point where we could get away with 1 car. It won't be easy, but I think we could do it. And we could save the money on insurance, on maintenance, on repairs. And so when we were able to do it, we sold Jessica's Chevy S10 pickup. Yes, that is right. Jessica did drive an S10 Chevy pickup. I drove a car, so you can figure that out. But we sold it. It was actually to our neighbor who had recently lost his vehicle and was in desperate need for a vehicle, and he didn't have a whole lot of money, so we sold it to him for a song, nothing even close to the Blue Book value of the vehicle. But it was building up treasure in heaven. Like I said, there is so much that we need to learn about the ROI of heavenly treasure, but all of us can do it. All of us can begin to apply that scrutiny that Warren Buffett used to invest his money to every dollar we spend. How can I leverage my earthly dollars to build up treasure in heaven? How can I make that the goal? Not everyone's going to go to a 1-car family. A lot of people can't do that. But there's all ways that we can think of in our own lives that we could apply that principle. Now, I wish I could say that it was as easy as just saying, you know what, I'm going to do it. I'm going to build up for myself treasure in heaven. I'm just going to make that decision. I'm going to commit to it. I wish it was that easy to invest wisely and amass treasure in heaven. But it's not. There's actually a disease in every one of us that needs to be cured to do it. And that's what Jesus is getting at with this analogy of the eyes being the lamp of the body. There was a common Greek conception that the eyes were like headlights in your body. That your eyes were like, when you're driving through the dark in your car, that your eyes would light up the area around you and that you could see. And Jesus gives a little bit of a twist to this metaphor because it's not so much about just what you see, it's how you take in what you perceive with your eyes, how you internalize it, how you make sense of it. It is as if Jesus is saying that you have to look at what glasses you're putting on when you're looking at your possessions and you're looking at your wealth. And depending upon how healthy your eyes are, how good those glasses that you're putting on, it'll make a tremendous difference in how you live, how you view your wealth, how you view your possessions, how you view your things. And I want to illustrate this with a story about a girl named Carolyn. Carolyn was 5 days away from walking in her high school graduation. She had an over 4.0 GPA. She had a drama scholarship. And then she was called into the principal's office. The principal sat her down and said, "You're going to graduate, but you're not allowed to walk in high school graduation. In fact, you're not even allowed to physically be on the property of the school because you're a liability." The whole plan had been concocted by Carolyn's mom. You see, at the age of 18, at 5 feet 6 inches, Carolyn weighed 78 pounds. She was days away from dying. She had anorexia. She didn't know it at the time. She wouldn't admit it at the time, but she had anorexia. Do you know when the first case of anorexia was diagnosed? Do you want to even guess? 1866 by Sir William Gould. And after he diagnosed the first patient, he kept seeing more patients. Do you know what fashion accessory was in vogue in 1866? You want to guess? It was the corset. With the help of the fashion boom and modern marketing, all of a sudden the shape of the body, the ideal shape, was no longer plump and shapely. It was thin. And if you were a woman, you could buy a corset and you could narrow down your waist to 20 inches. In fact, if you trained for a long time and you pulled it extra tight, you could actually get it down to 18 inches, maybe even 16 inches. Did you know that people who suffer from anorexia don't see themselves as fat? It's not that they look in the mirror and they go, oh, I am so fat, I need to lose some weight. They actually see someone who's thin. But they're constantly telling themselves that I need to be even thinner. And they connect their self-worth to their ability to become thinner and thinner. In Carolyn's words, listen to what she said. During the eating disorder, my self-worth was dictated by the voice of my eating disorder in my mind that was telling me that I was unlovable, that I wasn't worthy of love, that I was worthless. I developed an intense hatred of self, of my body, of my mind, of the exhausting routine that I was chained to, of my lack of control, and frankly, of my existence. It was so severe I lost sight of everything else in my life. My relationships, my hobbies, my goals, dreams, and life plan. There is nothing wrong with wanting to be thin, but when being thin is not thin enough, all of a sudden something that could be noble becomes a disease. It's a disease of the mind. It's a psychological disease. But there's actually a disease that predates the fashion boom during the Industrial Revolution. And there's a disease that affects not just a few, but it affects universally every single person. And it's the disease that has been called affluenza. Affluenza says that you will never be affluent. You could be rich, you could be poor, and you still suffer from affluenza. It is the idea that unless I have those things, unless I get those possessions, unless I have those cool clothes, unless I have that technology strapped to my body, unless I go on enough vacations, unless I have that membership with that club, unless I have those things, I'm not worthy enough. And you connect your worth to the things that you have. And even if you have a lot of those things, you're going to look in the mirror and you're going to say, I'm not thin enough. I'm not affluent enough. I don't have enough. I need more. I mean, here we are in one of the richest countries in the world. I mean, we have endured a pandemic far better than most countries in the world could ever imagine. I mean, they couldn't even think about, infusing their economy with millions of dollars, but we can do it with trillions of dollars. I mean, it is amazing to think about it, but how often every single one of us goes, including me, oh, if I could only have that, if I could only go on one more trip, if I could just afford that, then I could have it. It's a disease of the mind. And Jesus said, if your eye is unhealthy, if you're not looking through the right glasses, if you're looking at all those things in the world saying, I need to have them, they are mine, I need to have it to have worth, it fills your whole entire body with darkness. So what's the cure? How do we cure ourselves? Carolyn went home after she met with the principal. She got to her house. There were her parents, her siblings with their spouses, her youth minister, all sitting there in the living room waiting for her. It was an intervention. And they kept trying to convince her that she needed to get into a hospital. And it really was not until her youth minister, Luke, got into her face and said, "Do you know what you are doing to your father?" And in her own words, she said, "I need a new computer." In her own words, I looked over at my dad. He left the living room where everyone was sitting and had gone to the kitchen, was standing over the stove. Trying to regain his composure, in that fraction of a second, I had a moment of clarity and I saw through the disease. Carolyn was later admitted to one of the finest eating disorder hospitals in all the world. It's the same hospital that Mary Kate Olsen went to. It was the finest. Tens of thousands of dollars were spent. You know what? It did a little bit of good, it seemed, at the beginning. She gained 25 pounds in 87 days. That seemed like a win. But as soon as she left the hospital, she relapsed. In fact, her relapse was almost worse than when she came in. And it seemed that no matter what she did, she could not cure her disease. She said this, "How did I cure my disease? How did I get better?" Carolyn said one word, Jesus. "If I were left to my own devices, I would not be better. I'm better only because of the work he is doing in my heart." She goes on to say, "For me, worship music is what helped me see that Jesus was there with me in the midst of my suffering. It was the line, 'I'll never know how much it cost to see my sin upon that cross,' in the worship song, 'Here I Am to Worship.' We were singing it in chapel, and I just broke down. I remember I literally felt the walls around my heart crumble when I let Jesus in. I was sobbing and I was smiling. It was the first time I truly smiled in over a year and a half. And after I let Jesus in, he did the rest." We can try harder to make sure that our eyes are better, that we're seeing better, but there's a disease of the heart that needs to get fixed. And you might listen to Carolyn's words and go, "Well, that just sounds like, simple Christianese language. Oh, one word, Jesus." But think about it for a moment. If you broke your leg, you'd go to a doctor. If you needed help managing your finances, you'd probably go to a financial advisor. But who made the body? Who has given you everything that you have? How much more powerful is he able? Not that we shouldn't use those means. He's given us those means to use, but how much more powerful is he? And some of the deepest diseases of the mind that we have can only be healed by him who says, "You're worth it." The Apostle Paul says, "You know the grace of Jesus Christ, that he left the riches of heaven and became poor for your sake, so that you, by his poverty, might become rich." And the way that our hearts are healed from the disease of affluenza is we actually look at what God has done for us. I'll never know how much it cost to see my sin upon that cross, to know just how lavish God's love is. He was willing to leave it all so that we could become rich. And that act ought to make us want to be some of the most lavishly generous people the world has ever seen. It ought to make us want to take every one of our dollars and maximize its investment in heavenly treasure. And when our eyes when they see our possessions clearly, that they're not mine, but they're thine, that they're God's, when we begin to see things that way, we go, how can I leverage it all? Everything that I have, my time, my energy, my money, how can I leverage it all so that I can have more treasure in heaven? Invest wisely, amass treasure in heaven. Now, real quickly, the end of this verse talks about how you can't serve two masters. You'll love one or you hate the other. Well, when you read that, you should say, well, I don't really understand that, because I think you can love two masters. I mean, if I have two bosses, like, I might really love both bosses. They might really mean a lot to me, and I might really want to do a good job to both my bosses. But we have to understand what Jesus means by the word hate here. If we were to go to Genesis 29, you can do this on your own time, it actually says in that chapter of the Bible that Jacob loved Rachel more, but he loved Leah less. See how he said loved less? But then later on in chapter 29 of Genesis, it says that Jacob loved Rachel, but hated Leah. Well, how in the world, if just a few verses earlier, could it say, well, he loved her, he just didn't love her as much, but now all of a sudden he hates her? And how in the world did Jacob have all those children with Leah if he really hated her? It just doesn't make sense. It's an idiom. It's a figure of speech. It's just like if I would say, hey, get out of here. I didn't actually mean get out of here. I just meant what you're saying is ridiculous. What he's saying is that you can't love both ultimately. You're always going to love one more than you're going to love the other. Someday your boss is going to say, I need you at work on Monday at 9 o'clock, and your other boss is going to say, I need you at work at 9 o'clock on Monday, and you're going to have to choose which boss you're going to follow. And it's the same with our money. You can't serve God and money. One of them has to be your ultimate boss. It's about making idols, and it's so easy for us to make idols about our money. And the way that we conquer our idols is by loving something more than our idol. Loving God more than we love anything that we have. Invest wisely, amass treasure in heaven. So I have one last medical bit of trivia for you. You ready? This is going to be really good at parties you go to later today. You shouldn't be going to parties, though, with the pandemic, just so you know. 1783, Edward Jenner was confronted by the biggest killer of his day. Think COVID-19. It was smallpox. But Jenner had this idea. He noticed that milkmaids were not getting smallpox. And he had this theory that the milkmaids were getting cowpox, which was a less severe form of smallpox. And when they got it, they were actually able to fight off the smallpox. So Jenner said, you know, I'd like to start exposing people to cowpox. And he did that, and it worked. And you know what he called his new medical treatment? A vaccine. It's actually from the Latin word for cow, vacca. It was the first vaccine. All of us need a vaccine for affluenza, and it's generosity. And you know how you get generosity? Is you look to Christ, and you see how lavish his generosity has been for us. Now, there's a lot of ways to apply this sermon. It is Stewardship Sunday. You're going to find some cards by the bulletin, as is our tradition. And like I said, this is not the only application of this sermon, but it can be a powerful tool. Our planned giving cards are always a way for your session and for your finance committee to plan for 2021. That's their practical purpose. But on the other hand, they have an even more powerful purpose, is in that it allows us to plan. It says, you know what, instead of just having a little random act of kindness here, I want to plan how much I want to give in 2021. Now, you'll notice on the planned giving card, it says the word planned. And probably more than any other year, it's going to mean planned, because none of us know what 2021 is going to look like. So here's the deal. If you've been affected by the pandemic, or just been infected in general, and you're having financial hardship, you're having trouble putting food on the table, putting a roof over your head, paying the mortgage, put a 0 on that card. Put a 0 on the card. And you know, usually the session, myself, we never look at those cards, but if you put a 0 on them, we might give you a call and say, hey, is everything okay? Is there anything your church family can be helping you with? And you should welcome that phone call if you get it and you need help. And you should be willing to say, hey, you know what, I do need some help. Because that's what church families are for. We're here to help each other, and we will do the best of our ability to help you if you're in some need. So use that card as actually a very subtle way of saying, you know what, church family, I need a little help. For the rest of us, do the best you can to do to plan. Some of us are going to end up giving less. Some of us will end up giving more in 2021, and our prayer is that it all washes up. Number 2, the card allows us to prioritize. Make that giving your highest priority. You know, before the taxes come out, before the contribution to the pre-tax retirement plan, make that the most important check, the important expense that you have in the year. Make that the priority because you say, I want to make generosity what I'm all about. Then make it proportional. You know what, if Mr. Warren Buffett decided he was going to give $100,000 to our church, well, that would be really nice if he did that. It wouldn't cost him a whole lot, though. Now, if Jessica and I were to give $100,000, we'd be a little bit more like the woman who gave the little 2 copper coins in the coffer for Jesus. But give proportionally. That is, figure out a percentage, not just the amount, but, you know, get together with your spouse and pray about what is an appropriate percentage of what God has given us to give to his ministry through First Presbyterian Church, Wellsboro. So plan it, prioritize it, make it proportional, use it as a tool. I think we all need a little bit of work in generosity. Giving to the church might be the most important way, but there are also many ways, and hopefully that will be the gateway to make us all leverage our earthly dollars for heavenly dollars. Invest wisely. Let us amass treasure in heaven. Would you pray with me? Gracious Heavenly Father, you have given us so much. You have been lavish with us. And at this time where we just see, it seems things are so scarce, there is a tendency for us just to want to hold on. Help us, Lord, to open our hands, open our hearts, open our minds to being generous and lavish, of following the example of your Son, Jesus Christ, who gave up so much for us. Help us know the blessing of giving is so much more than receiving. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Let us rise as you are able and join in our song of response.